Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Carrie Wilshusen, and I am the Dean of Student Services and Director of Admissions at Maine Law. Each year, we highlight the extraordinary work of our students in a Student Impact Summit. This year, we're featuring the work of our Youth Justice Program at Maine Law. We're joined today by our moderator, Jill Ward. Jill is the director of our Center for Youth Policy and Law and an adjunct professor. Maine Law is fortunate to have a national leader in youth justice reform, bringing myriad opportunities to our students. And I'm not exaggerating when I call her a national leader. Director Ward was just named as a senior policy advisor to the United States Department of Justice's Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the OJJDP. I'm also thrilled to be joined by Professor Sarah Branch. Professor Branch has served in the judiciary, the government, and as a defense attorney. She now brings her enthusiasm for the delivery of equitable justice to her students. And of course, the extraordinary students, and now 2 alums. I'll pass it over to Director Ward to make those introductions. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Carrie, and welcome everybody to this conversation about, as we like to say, doing justice in the Youth Justice Clinic and the Center for Youth Policy and Law. I'm here with my colleague and partner in crime, Professor Sarah Branch, and we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of the work that we do here at the center and in the Youth Justice Clinic. And then we're going to hear from prior and current clinics and center students about their experience and what they can tell you about what it's like to be in the clinic and do some of the practice and policy work that we are going to cover this afternoon. So what makes, I think, this the most unique enterprise, the Youth Justice Clinic and the Center for Youth Policy and Law, is that we have set up a model here in the Cumberland Legal Aid Clinic where we combine policy and practice. One informs the other, and we do this work very collaboratively. So in the Youth Justice Clinic, which you will hear some more about shortly, there's student attorneys representing clients who have come in contact with the law and are involved in delinquency court. And then with the Center on Youth Policy and Law, we tackle the more systemic policy-related issues that come from the experience that students and the clinic have in representing those clients and helping them overcome the challenges that they encounter in court. And so let me give you an example of what this looks like and how these 2 things came together to both impact individual client outcomes and also to change policy in the state of Maine for all young people. So several years ago, we had students in the then Juvenile Justice Clinic who were representing clients who, when they were coming for their appearance in court, were appearing in shackles, wrist shackles, handcuffs, and leg shackles. And student attorneys were first sort of like, why is this necessary? These are children, these are young people. Why is this happening? And what is the rationale? But also, let's make it stop. And so part of the representation was filing motions to get the shackles removed when the young people were coming before court. But it was happening so frequently that several of the students said, why is this the policy? This shouldn't be the policy. We shouldn't be arguing and making this motion on an individualized basis. We should just change the policy. And then we don't have to make this motion every time we are trying to represent a young person in court who is very much compromised and psychologically damaged and influenced by the fact that they're trying to understand what's happening to them, and they're showing up and they're in handcuffs and shackles. And it's very difficult then to engage in what is going on for them in terms of the hearing. So several students said to the clinic director at the time, how do we change this? So how we change this is we write a law. And so clinic students worked with impacted individual clients, with myself as a policy advocate and consultant before the center was officially established, to come up with a strategy, identify a sponsor in the legislature, and do all of the sort of policy related steps, draft the legislation, engage a coalition of folks, work with impacted community members to testify. And we put forward a proposal before the Maine legislature. That proposal was successful. Now, one of the things you will learn when you do policy work is these things happen on a political landscape that sometimes works in your favor and sometimes does not. And so while we had a majority of the Maine legislature pass this policy that would ban the indiscriminate shackling of young people in court, it was ultimately vetoed by the governor at the time. And when the vote came back to override the veto, it failed. And so, so after much gnashing of the teeth, we did what we always do at the Policy Center. We pivoted to another strategy, and we approached the judicial branch and requested a rule be made in lieu of the statute to affect the same policy change. And lo and behold, the judicial branch came through, issued a rule later that year after the legislature had rejected the legislation. And it is now law in the state that you cannot indiscriminately shackle young people when they come for their parents in court. So that is just one very clear example of how we work here in the clinic, where the representation and the things that student attorneys see in the courtroom can translate into policy change, systemic change that impacts all young people. So that's my example. I'd like to turn it over to my partner in crime, or not crime, Professor Branch, to talk a little bit about the Youth Justice Clinic and what that client representation looks like.
Yes, thank you so much, Jill. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to briefly just sort of discuss the clinic model itself, if you may not be familiar with it. Essentially, in law school, you're going to study in books, and you're going to learn about criminal law in the abstract. And the clinic is an opportunity to get in and get experiential learning, hands-on learning. You have cases, you have clients. And it is in this opportunity and within this opportunity where you're going to be seeing exactly what Professor Ward was describing, which is things that strike you as maybe not right, defy common sense, don't feel just. And the beauty of the clinic model is you are working with individual clients on individual cases and doing justice in those cases, while also having the opportunity to ask the whys. So I was in court today with 4 different student attorneys, and we were in multiple jurisdictions addressing multiple issues, and the conversations were going across the students, across to the state, and then calls are being made to people within the community. And some student attorneys, former student attorneys on this call were a part of that. And we address sort of systemic issues as a team. So the beauty of Maine and coming to Maine is that it is a geographically large state, but it is a very small community, and your impact can be huge. You can change the landscape for kids going forward. And that feels amazing when oftentimes you're working in oppressive structures that don't feel like it's ever working towards justice in the way that it should. So I'm just briefly talking about the clinic. The clinic is a great place to do this. It's a great place to see what you learn, for example, in criminal law or in juvenile law, come to life in real life cases and have an impact in a single case that can have a ripple effect to the larger community here in Maine. I believe at this point, we're supposed to transition to the people who are really going to inspire you, and the student attorneys or former student attorneys who are doing justice in their own right. If they want to join this conversation, we'll turn it over to them to describe in a little more detail what their experiences have been. Team Justice.
Team Justice, yes. And I would like to invite Kelsey maybe to speak first, only because she has an experience that ties directly to an even third expansion of the shackling scenario that I presented, to just show you how it really never ends, that you continue to change policy beyond the individual and state level. So Kelsey, do you want to share a little bit?
Sure. So my name is Kelsey Cromie. I'm a 3L at Maine Law. I spent the spring of my 2L, the summer in between my 2L and 3L, and the fall of my 3L year in the clinic, I am not in clinic this semester and miss it dearly. But I was able to argue in state and federal court and represent clients in both during my experiences in the clinic. And so knowing the background of our work on indiscriminate shackling, when I appeared in federal court and my client was shackled, I immediately came back and started talking to Jill about what we could do about it. And so we updated the motion and were able to file it in federal court and begin to educate even more members of the judiciary and the legal community about the indiscriminate shackling of youth, and protect our clients along the way from the psychological harms that comes with that, and to just remind people that they're children and they're not malicious human beings. They are children, and that they deserve the care and attention throughout this process that in and of itself is traumatizing. Additionally, I, through Jill's connections in the center, the juvenile law class has gotten to take a tour of Long Creek Youth Development Center the last 2 years. And through conversations there, I learned a little bit more about just education at Long Creek and the A.R. Gould School there, and learned that students who attend school there are issued a diploma from the A.R. Gould School, and noticed that conflict with Maine's record sealing bill and how students whose records are sealed might still have a diploma that lets people know that they were incarcerated. And so I wrote a paper for my education law class this fall and turned it over to Jill in the center, and have a position this semester that does not allow me to take positions on anything pending before the legislature. But so I'm not really sure what's happening right now, but I was able to turn that paper over, which was really exciting.
So I get to tell you, Kelsey, while I tell all of the other students what's going on with that. So it turned into a resolve before the legislature, and a former student was up there today in Augusta giving testimony and working with the sponsor to come to some compromise language around the Department of Education, giving guidance and educating superintendents and principals from high schools who might be associated with the individual student's home community about this conflict, and making sure that students who may have spent time incarcerated or system involved have the option to get their diploma from their sending school or a Maine diploma, but not necessarily having to list where they got their diploma from if it was from the school that's inside the facility, so that that ability to move forward and those collateral consequences are mitigated. So again, another example of something student-led, and then students pass them on to other students. I mean, it's not, it's not a one and done. And I think, at this point, I might call on maybe Jess Mizzy, who knows how long you can work on these projects once you get engaged with the clinic and some of this work, to maybe speak to what that's like, how easy that is, and maybe speak to some of what Professor Branch was talking about with respect to Maine being sort of a small community, which is why you can have a big impact.
Hi all, Jess Mitzi. I am a Maine Law alum. I graduated last year. And yeah, the summer after 1L year, or really during 1L year, I started working for Jill, and also was like doing research for clinic, and then spent a lot 2L summer in clinic and all of 3L year. So was also supervised by Sarah Branch. So I've done a lot of legislative projects, and also have been on the student attorney side of things as well. Yeah, and a lot of what I did was legislative tracking. And I think that may be the most important takeaway from law school, especially law school in Maine, is anybody can do anything in the legislature if you try hard enough. If you do the research and you find a sponsor, you can make a lot happen. Not quickly, but you can make it happen for sure. I think I tracked some bills that carried over from session to session and are, still being worked on, even though that's not directly what I have my hands in anymore. But aside from the legislative tracking that I did with Jill, as I said already, I was also a student attorney in the clinic for a full year, and got to represent youth in court constantly. A lot of my experience, at least at the beginning, was remote, just by nature of when I was in law school. Towards the end, juvenile court was back in person, so got to go down to Biddeford, and spend a lot of time in person in Lewiston District Court, but not on the youth side. One of the other huge projects that I worked on with Jill was the regional care teams, which was, it is still a DOC-led, a Maine Department of Corrections-led group, but it's bringing together providers, youth serving agencies in all of the 3 DOC regions in Maine that covers the entire state of Maine, to kind of bring a community focus onto youth and the problems that they're facing, and to provide resources and brainstorming across agencies, and also the JJAG, the Juvenile Justice Advisory Group for the state, provides funding for that project as well, for youth to access resources that they might not otherwise have. So it was, my experience was pretty holistic. I got to see in court, but also at these regional care teams, how we can serve youth in this holistic way, not just band-aids on their legal issues, but how do we support them to keep them out of the system, and how do we keep the system from retaining hooks in them, so it's just not a vicious cycle over and over again. Jill, is there anything I'm forgetting?
No, that's great. That's great. And I would invite any other, John, I know you had some experience, and Jeanette, you're now with Disability Rights Maine in an externship, if I have that right. Is anything striking you all that you want to share based on the conversation? I want you to share what you think you would want prospective students to know.
I think the bill that John worked on is an example of legislation moving quickly. He wants to talk about that.
And just remind folks where you are now, if you're no longer, Jess, I don't know if you said where you're working, but you should do that, so everybody understands where you all landed and some of the good work you're still doing.
Yeah, so I'm at Pine Tree Legal Assistance in Portland, and I have a 2-year family law fellowship here, so I don't get to work with youth in exactly the same way as I did at the clinic, which makes me a little sad, but I still get to work with them on special immigrant juvenile status, and in the context of PFAs and Title IX investigations through schools.
And PFAs are?
Protection from abuse, sorry.
That's okay.
Does it make, Jill, do you want me to talk a little bit about my legislative experience?
Yeah, talk about that, and then anything else you want to add. Really, I think this is you sharing your experience.
Okay. Well, hi, everybody. My name is John Roboris, and I am currently in private practice at a firm in Portland, and I do school law now. So I'm sort of still working with youth, just on a different side, in a different capacity. Sarah's laughing because sometimes we have there's some tough calls on this side of the work, but I feel like I was very adequately prepared for this work by my work in the clinic. And to talk to the legislative experience a little bit, I feel in my heart of hearts that I am a criminal defender through and through, and hopefully someday have the opportunity to do that work more, whether on a pro bono basis or through the Office of a Public Defender, which I'm going to say right now the state needs. But anyway, when I was in law school and working the clinic, I felt really strongly about working not just with youth who may have committed crimes or may be wrongfully charged, but also with youth who may have in fact done what they were accused of doing, and recognizing that those youth need sympathy and empathy as well, and that oftentimes criminal conduct and criminal behavior comes out of a really tough life experience. And one of my favorite authors, who everyone knows, Brian Stevenson, always says that you are more than the worst thing you've ever done. And so I really believe that. I started volunteering at Long Creek and met a couple of youth who had been bound over. And at the risk of talking forever, the brief overview of the bind over process is that in the state of Maine is when you are a juvenile under the age of 18 or a youth, who has committed an offense serious enough that the prosecutor feels the offense should be charged under the adult criminal code, they can file a petition to bind you over into adult criminal court and prosecute you as an adult, even though you are not. And those decisions in Maine almost always favor the prosecution. That petition goes before a judge, there's a hearing, and almost always the judge binds the juvenile over for a number of reasons. But those decisions are often heartbreaking because they're the difference between a few years spent in a facility somewhat tailored to help youth and cater to youth and life in prison in some cases, or a very long time, what could be the equivalent of life. So that's a magnanimous decision in a young person's life. And I noticed that the state, if they were to lose the bind over decision, could appeal immediately. The juvenile, if they lost, could not. They would have to wait till the resolution of the criminal case in criminal court. And that felt like a wildly unfair power imbalance that needed to be corrected. So with Jill's help and with now managing director Chris Northrop's help, we talked about what to do. And so we thought about proposing a legislative solution, which was a small textual change, but I'm not allowed to call it a small change. I've been banned from doing that for people on the call. So it was a textual change that just allowed the youth to appeal that decision immediately if they lost. And quite frankly, they were losing all the decisions. So, and the other interesting piece is a lot of times youth who are bound over, the fact that they couldn't appeal until after the resolution of their criminal case, they would often plea and enter plea agreements where they gave up their right to appeal that bind over decision. So we wanted to make sure they could appeal before they entered any agreement like that. And the really cool part about all this, and I may be talking in a million different ways, but the really cool part, so we drafted this bill, we organized support, got a legislative sponsor, did all that. But the coolest part about this was I actually had the opportunity to talk with and write testimony for youth who had been bound over. So Dominic Sylvester was one, and then I forget the other's last name. I forget the other kid's name, but Dominic Sylvester was one. Jess and I talked to him on the phone, and I was able to write their testimony and submit it on their behalf. And in the work group session, that was really powerful because you could hear exactly what having an opportunity to appeal would have meant. And quite honestly, at least one of those bind over decisions, there was a pretty good argument on appeal, but they entered a plea agreement and gave up that right to appeal. So I got to work with those youth. I got to engage in the legislative process as a student, and in 1 year's time, changed the law, which was pretty cool. And I don't know if you would have had that opportunity at another law school. I think Maine law is pretty uniquely positioned to give students that opportunity. So all that being said, that's my legislative experience.
That's great, John. I like hearing you talk about it. The energy is fantastic. So Jeanette, do you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing and what your experience has been in the clinic, just to add another perspective?
Absolutely, sure. So my name is Jeanette Plord. I'm a 3L at Maine Law. I was a fellow at the Maine Center for Youth Policy and Law after my 1L year, student attorney in the Youth Justice Clinic, spring of 2L, and then the summer between 2L and 3L, I was the full-time student attorney at the clinic. And I feel like my experience with the clinic and with the policy center has really been under the guidance and supervision of Sarah and Jill and others in the clinic. I feel as though I have directly participated in improving outcomes for youth who've been entangled in law enforcement. Jill mentioned there's changing the law, but I've also had the opportunity to advocate in high-level adversarial meetings with DOC. For example, an opportunity to sit directly across the table from the Associate Commissioner of the Department of Corrections and point out the fact that DOC policies to protect youth of rights weren't being followed within the walls of Long Creek, which is the youth prison in Maine. In addition, I've had the opportunity to advocate in court on cases, trying out arguments that point to large problems within the system. But while pointing to large problems, it's on the level of impacting a human, an actual individual right before us, and to try to change the way the players, the assistant district attorneys, the judges, regard this person and use their discretion within the process. So for example, I had an opportunity as a student attorney, this was during my first semester clinic, to really start to influence the way some of the judges and assistant district attorneys were thinking about fundamental liberty rights. When a youth is arrested, he or she is given a summons and says, this is the charge, you have to come back and appear at court. It could be anywhere from these days, 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 months later. During that time, that youth is under the supervision of someone called a juvenile community corrections officer. That person has an extraordinary amount of power over the fate of this youth. If that JCCO wishes, the JCCO will allow these charges to pursue to the assistant district attorney's office. Usually where some representation begins is when that youth finally shows up in court on that first day and has an appearance. What happens at that point is that youth gets a lawyer of the day. Quite literally, for that one day, a lawyer is assigned to that youth, and often the clinic is appointed lawyer of the day. So this one particular time, we happen to have 5 clients, which is a unique opportunity to see 5 sets of proposed conditions of release. These are contracts that youth have to sign in order to not essentially be incarcerated until their case is resolved. It was interesting to see that regardless of the crime, regardless of the charge, regardless of the youth, all of the same conditions were showing up for every single youth, including with the same cursive handwriting and the same part of every single contract, a condition that said, oh, the JCCO is also allowed at his or her discretion to determine at any time that that youth is now under house arrest. That's a fundamental liberty right. And so I spoke with my supervisor at the time and I said, what on earth is this? And she said, you want to argue it? I said, of course I want to argue this. And so I had the chance in court to actually argue that this was ridiculous and the youth should not be subject to this condition. And, the judge heard it. And so I just feel like this is the participation, this is the starting to some of those larger movements, that Jess, that John, and that Kelsey were talking about. It sort of directly feeds into some of those larger projects that the clinic is working on. I don't want to take too much time, but I do want to mention a couple of other things. John mentioned that, some youth do bad things. I want to point out, yes, I am at Disability Rights Maine right now on an externship. Most of the youth, and that's most, quite literally most youth, are charged for behaviors that are manifestations of disabilities, or they are youth with disabilities. And so working with Jill as a fellow in the summer, I was able to do a lot of research around one particular county's schools and to observe through public records how interesting it was that youth with disabilities, and especially youth with disabilities of color, were extraordinarily disproportionately represented in the number of encounters with law enforcement as compared to their non-disabled counterparts and not of color. So it's sort of interesting projects like that I've also been able to do with Jill. And I think I will wrap up with that. Thank you.
No, that's great. That's terrific. So I think I would invite, I think you're hearing a range of things that you get to engage in when you're part of the clinic, and the sort of common, not joke, but the way we talk about it here. And I know the way that the dean talks about it is it's a sort of make your own, choose your own adventure kind of enterprise. It's that, and it's always with the purpose, I hope you're hearing loud and clear, to improve young people's lives, whether it's through the individual representation or whether it's through policy and change work, that we're always trying to keep heartily at the center the young person that we're thinking of and talking about and representing and advocating on behalf of. And so I think that makes us incredibly unique, and the access that you've heard described is part of it. I wonder if anyone wants to say a little bit more. And Sarah, you're sort of new in this role at the clinic, what your experience has been just diving right in with all of these cast of characters, having been a practitioner before and now teaching justice.
I mean, I have to say that I've been sitting here and I mean, I seriously have the best job. And so you're all just going to have to be jealous of me. When you do defense work for a really long time, it can get tough. I think, you know, Jeanette Plourde was one of my first students, as was Jess Mizzy. And it's such a bucket filling environment where you get fired up all over again. And it doesn't take a lot to fire me up, but like, you know, the tank can run low. And working with these students and seeing their passion and being like, you want to argue that? Let's do this. Let's go in there. And just even today, we were in court down in Biddeford, and there was a student attorney who was going in. His client wasn't even there, and a warrant was going to be issued for his arrest. And I'm like, don't let it happen. Fight. You may lose, but fight. And the judge went at this student attorney, and the student attorney stood there and took it and did awesome and just pushed back. Talked about the Sixth Amendment, talked about what is right. And I won't mention the charge, but let's just say ridiculous that they would warrant this charge and put this kid in handcuffs and throw them in Long Creek for it. And I said to the student afterwards, I mean, I was just so proud of this moment for him, what he did for this child, and what he did to push back against a judge who was doing something in my mind that was wrong. And that sometimes that's the role of the defense attorney. So the opportunity, not just for what you do to the student, for the client, what you do in terms of educating, but in terms of how you develop as a lawyer. Each one of the students that I worked with that are on this panel, they level up. You get informed on how to do it, why you're doing it. My hope humbly is that they get better at it, and then they enter the force and fight justice out on their own. And I know all of these attorneys will do that. I make fun of John, but he's doing justice secretly behind the doors. So the clinic gives that chance to put people out into the community to help you become a better lawyer, and frankly, to have some perspective on what justice really is. So I was just thinking, like, I've got the best job, so I'm super excited.
Can I just mind if I'd like to piggyback off that. I never had the privilege of having Sarah as a clinical professor, but I think there's change on a systemic level, which we were talking about earlier. And then what Jeanette and Sarah are really touching on is not only the change in the student attorney, but the change in an individual's life that you can make through your representation at the juvenile or the youth justice clinic. Sorry, I still got to make that name change. But two examples that really come to mind for me is on the warrant side of things that Sarah was just talking about. I had a very similar situation when I was a student attorney in person at a lawyer of the day in Biddeford, actually, where the youth didn't appear for their court appearance, and the judge issued a warrant based on that failure to appear. And I was encouraged by managing director, now then director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic, Chris Northrup, to continue. Court closed at 4. If you can get this warrant recalled by 4 o'clock, you've done a good job. So I worked hard to try and find ways, and I actually ended up through social media finding the client, and I was able to video conference him into court. The judge accepted that at his first appearance and recalled the warrant, much to the chagrin of the prosecutor. But that was, without being too dramatic, could have been the difference between 2-3 nights a week spent in Maine's youth prison or not, and being out and available to go to his next court appearance and continuing with his life uninterrupted, right? And so it felt really good to be that change maker. And then also, like, shifting further down the line of criminal charges and the process, I was able in the clinic to represent almost, not solo, but obviously with some supervision and guidance, but you're doing a lot of the work yourself as a student attorney. And I was able to represent clients who had a variety of charges, from misdemeanors and traffic violations, all the way up to Class A felonies. And that was some of the most rewarding work I've ever done. And one particular example I'm thinking of, it was a very serious charge for my client. And I said to Professor Northrup, like, oh, can we take this on? And he was like, no. And then I just didn't shut up about it and kept asking him. And finally, he gave in and was like, what the hell is wrong with you? Fine, but no more. So we took on this client, and over my final semester in law school, literally it tracked the beginning of the semester to the end. We were able to go through a significant amount of motions practice and of negotiation, and we ended up getting the charges dismissed. This is a Class A felony. I mean, this could have significantly derailed this 14-year-old's life. And now I'm no longer in touch with this client, but I mean, if that charge had not been dismissed, there's no telling what he would have been prevented from doing because of all the barriers and challenges that come with even with a criminal record or even court participation or systemic involvement. So it was such a rewarding experience, and change on the individual level can also be so impactful. And that's such a reason to attend Maine Law and participate in the clinic and do this type of work, because that's such a rewarding experience. And I hadn't even passed the bar yet. Like, I'm just so grateful to have had that opportunity. And so you can make change on the systemic level, but really make change on an individual level as well.
And I think we should really underscore that when you come into the clinic, and whether you're a student attorney doing representation work, or you work in the policy center as a fellow, you're doing it. Like, I mean, and y'all better nod, because I know I make you do my stuff. And I know that Professor Branch, when you are sworn in, you are practicing, you are doing the work. And I don't know if maybe, John made that point, but just to be clear, I mean, Sarah and I are very passionate about what we're doing, but we're also passionate about making sure the next generation of us knows how to do it too, and all of it, not just a part of it, but all of it. And then figuring out what part moves you, what part gets you going and informs like the decisions you make while you're at law school and how you use your degree when you graduate. So I don't want anyone to walk away from this webinar thinking you're not going to do all of the things, because you will do all of the things if you come to the clinic. So I wanted to say one more thing before maybe we entertain questions if they're out there. And I certainly hope there are some. We'd love to have this be a little bit more of a back and forth. But John slipped up on our name change, and I wanted to just raise up for everybody why we switched from calling ourselves the Juvenile Justice Clinic to the Youth Justice Clinic and the Center for Juvenile Policy and Law to Youth Policy and Law. And that is really what's going on in this field. And that is also a representation of what you will get here at Maine Law. The field is moving towards acknowledging that first of all, juvenile has a lot of derogatory sort of connotations to it that are not in line with most purposes of the juvenile system, and treating kids as kids and really trying to support and foster kids' transition into adulthood. And it's also a recognition that youth is a pretty expansive timeline when it comes to brain development and development into adulthood. 18 is pretty arbitrary. It's what's in most law around, at least the juvenile and criminal code, as sort of the differentiation between the two systems. And we here at the Youth Justice Clinic and at the Center for Youth Policy and Law recognize that there isn't a lot of difference between a 17-year-old and a 19-year-old in a lot of meaningful ways when it comes to how they are treated by the law. And so we made this shift. There's a lot of research into the emerging adult sort of population, which is that 18 to 25, maybe 27, depends on which research you look at and who you talk to, but really starting to make sure that our law is actually reflective of where humans are in their development and what appropriate expectations are and what appropriate responses, legal responses are. So recognizing that youth and young adults it's coming to be a term in the criminal and juvenile justice fields. We sort of wanted to move with those times and with that curve, and it really expand the way that we look at providing our support for young people who come in contact with these systems to be really expansive and accurate, for lack of a better word. So that is why we made the name change last fall, and are doing more work with that young adult population in that philosophy. So And I'm seeing you're free to type your questions. We're going to empower you out there to speak up if you would like to. And while we're waiting, if any of the conversation has moved anyone else, Kelsey, you're nodding. Wants to add anything?
I think I wanted to emphasize the team atmosphere in the clinic. John was my legal writing TA and dragged me into the clinic the spring of my 1L year. It dragged is a strong word. I ran willingly into policy meetings, and then worked with John and Jess and Jeanette throughout my 2L year. I ended up taking a lot of Jess's clients when she graduated, which was really cool to get to kind of see the evolution that way. And then Jeanette and I have worked together on a bunch of things, but one of the ones that really stands out to me is over the summer, Jeanette came back talking about how she had proposed an interpretation of the restitution code. And knowing that, when I returned to court with a client who the restitution he was required to pay was going to be devastating, was able to then take Jeanette's argument and continue it for additional youth. And so the knowledge that the clinic is able to share and how we pass it from student to student and are able to make a larger impact that way because it's so collaborative and we're talking about what we're working on. Clinic operates on a case rounds model, so similar to the medical model where once a week we meet and talk about our cases and students are able to share their perspectives and ideas and give us new directions to go has been so helpful for me in developing not only my case strategy, but also my style as an attorney and making sure that I am developing into my own person, but also learning from the people around me. I am in a unique position where I've been supervised by most of the faculty members in the clinic. Throughout my time, I've had 3 different supervisors, which has been, plus I've done work for Jill, which has been incredible to get to learn from 4 truly phenomenal advocates in each of their own way. And I've gotten to take a little bit of each of their styles and incorporate it into my own. And it's been great to learn from them along the way. And clinic has been truly the highlight of my Maine law experience.
I'll add on to the team-based component just to really hammer it home about one of the best things about the clinic is the relationships you build, not just among clinic students, but also among with faculty and with system stakeholders as well. And I think that's a really unique piece of the experience you get. We are all on this call, all former clinic students around the time that I was there, as well as all faculty, still remain close, still stay in touch. I've actually been able, because of the relationships that I made through the clinic, to continue working in a pro bono capacity with Jill and with Sarah and with the clinic and the policy center generally. So right now we're working on legislation out of a law review article that Jill, myself, Jess, and Professor Northrop wrote, and Kelsey actually published. So see all the intermingling here. But it's just the relationships are so incredibly strong, and to be able to build those relationships and not have them stop once you graduate, I think is a super unique piece of your clinic experience as well. And I love this area of law. I love policy, and I'm able to continue to do it because of the relationships I built in the clinic and at the center. And so I think that's a really, really strong selling point as to why you should do the clinic or sign up for the clinic. And I'm actually engaged to a former clinic student as well. So there are all these tons of relationship building you can do.
I think we actually have a question.
Go ahead, Jess.
No, we got a question in the
We did.
chat.
I thought you wanted to comment, but I'll
Yeah.
drop the question and you can respond to it. So the
Great.
question is, with all of the really rewarding work you're all doing, it can be hard at times. And how do you deal with potential burnout and preventing it? Excellent question.
Great question. I was in social work before I went to law school, so I think that I had like years of practice of just having like really ridiculously healthy boundaries. So like not taking my work home with me. But I'm not gonna lie, there were times that it was very much tested. I mean, Sarah supervised me my last semester of law school, which was like, for a multitude of reasons, my hardest. A lot of it because I like had knee surgery right before that semester, and like a lot of my coping skills got taken away. But I think that we talk about boundaries so much, and we talk about like what we need to take care, like what we need to do to take care of ourselves so much, that like even when I was like not feeling my best, like I felt very supported to like be able to step away and like do what I needed to do to like make myself feel better so that I could keep doing the work. But yeah, I think just like boundaries, just having a really healthy sense of like, this is what I do for work, and then this is what I do when I'm not at work. And I think that served me super well and continues to do so, because everyone that I work with right now, like all of my clients are survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. And it's like, you got to leave that at work. I can't take it with me all of the time. So the clinic really modeled that. But you know, my short answer is I like to play sports when I'm not at the clinic.
Kelsey, I was going to ask if anyone else wanted to respond to that question.
I was just going to say that this is probably the thing that I worked the most on with Sarah as my supervisor this fall, was finding ways to set boundaries and finding ways to make sure I was taking care of myself, in addition to taking care of my clients the way I needed to. And so the clinic definitely supports that endeavor as you are learning and exploring and figuring out what your boundaries are and how you determine what they are. I didn't always do it gracefully. There were definitely weeks that were hard, and weeks where I knew I was managing it poorly. But I think that the work we did in the clinic has set me up where this semester I have really worked hard at setting those boundaries, and feel much better about entering the legal field, being able to set those boundaries and care for myself in addition to clients.
And I'm just going to chime in to say I was terrible at setting boundaries. Anybody that was there at the time I was at the clinic, I really did struggle to leave work at work. I often went sort of the extra mile for, not that I had to, but I wanted to help clients in ways that my job description didn't necessarily entail. And I think that did create some challenges for me, and especially around burnout. I hadn't had the prior experience that Jess had, so I had to sort of figure it out on the fly. But the one thing I will say is, maybe this was just a product of my situation, but clients, the compassionate and empathetic client-centered representation that you provide at the clinic, clients understand that you're a human too. Like that's a real component of the attorney-client relationship that you build with your clients. And so I learned later, which I wish I had learned sooner, that no client is going to think you're failing them because the representation that you're providing them is putting their interests first and letting them be heard. And so like it's easier to set those boundaries when that's the type of representation that you provide. And I didn't learn that till later on, but I do think that that's like the whole time you're in clinic, we're talking about centering the client and listening to your client and hearing your client. And when clients feel heard, sometimes that's all it takes. And so they'll identify that you're human too and respect your boundaries as well. And it is easier because of the way you do the work.
Thanks, John. Sarah, do you want to speak to that a little bit just from the supervisor's role?
I do. So if you are looking at Maine at all, you're going to see that we are struggling with providing indigent defense. It is a passion of mine. I am determined, as I probably Jess and Kelsey and Jeanette probably felt, to teach sustainability of practice, because this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. And you have to learn how you're going to work in this world so that you can continue to do the work. There is no there's no glory in doing it for 1 year and burning out and being like, I can never go back. That's not my goal as your professor. I want you to learn the skills to be able to go in, do the justice, bring the rain, and then learn how to take care of yourself, take care of the people that you care about, take care of your colleagues, to, you know, recognize when you are reaching those limits and learning those, you know, law school is going to haze you. It's going to test who you are and make you think about what you thought you knew. And some of that is good, some of that is unhealthy. And I'm just going to name that. You know, the clinic, we're trying to teach you how to be a lawyer. And so part of that is, what time do you eat dinner? Remember to eat dinner. Remember to drink water. Remember to stop for a minute and clear your head and meditate, whatever it takes. There you go, Kelsey, drink that water. It's small things, listening to music. It's big things, saying no. You know, we have a bunch of phrases we use, whatever works for your brain, whatever works for your personality. I try and meet you where you're at and help you level up that skill set so that you can be the best you when you go into this work. Because that's my goal. More people doing this work.
Man, all right. Any other pearls? No. Any other question? Oh, another question? Have another question? No, just to thank you for our insightful answers. That's awesome. Kelsey, did you want to say something?
It looks like we have a question. What does it look like to support clients and students beyond the Portland area with clinical and policy work?
That's a good question. I think we're good. Well, I'll take the policy part, and I will say that I think even though we do work in Maine, policy work in Maine, it is not necessarily Maine centric. So I will say that some of the research, and I'm trying to recall whether any of you were involved in this research, but for instance, when we did some policy work around establishing the minimum age of juvenile court jurisdiction here in the state at 12, some of the research involved looking at other state statutes, talking to people in other states, talking to advocates in other states about the arguments that worked before the legislature and the ones that didn't. What were the practice differences that informed some of those arguments? Some states have systems like children in need of service systems. We don't have one of those in Maine. That was a point of contention in talking through the policy implications of what we were proposing. So I think when you do the policy work, I think, and I will certainly let Professor Branch speak to the practice side, it's not in a vacuum. It's not just in the state of Maine. You learn more probably in New England than necessarily across the country, but it depends on the issue. You know, which jurisdiction is cutting edge on this? Which jurisdiction has the most to teach us? Which looks the most like Maine? So I think that's part of that answer. And I think the other part is I come to this role with a lot of federal experience. You heard that at the beginning. And there's an opportunity there for education at the federal level, if that's what you're interested in. And I'm going to come back to the choose your own adventure. You know, if you're not interested in the federal law, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking to you about it. You know, if you're interested in making change where you're living, where you're working, where you're in school right now, that tends to be the focus, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, those relationships and that experience are part of what you will get exposure to. And what you want to do with that is just being like John and saying, I want to do that. Help me do that thing. And, you know, I think we're all with what we bring to the table more than willing to do that with the students. Sarah?
And I'll just speak to location. So the clinic, it's called the Cumberland Legal Aid Clinic, but we really can go anywhere. And I will just say within the Cumberland Legal Aid Clinic is the Youth Justice Clinic. One of our other newest clinics is a rural practice clinic. And so that's up in Fort Kent. If you're not from Maine, check it out. It's about 6 hours north of Portland, right on the border of Canada. And we have a clinic there. So you can go up there, you would live in a dorm, you can do general practice clinic up there. But again, the professor that's up there will, you know, if you want to do all youth justice cases, he would be fine with that. Again, we're trying to meet you where you're at and take you to where you want to go. And so I'm a big believer that we need to be better about the rural communities. There are not enough lawyers there. It's harder to access justice, and we need to be diligent in training people and interesting people in the beautiful Fort Kent region, or if you want to go to Skowhegan, you want to go wherever. Putting lawyers there is part of access to justice, and there is no limit to where the Cumberland Legal Aid Clinic can go. We happen to take most of our cases, Portland, Lewiston, and Biddeford, merely to maximize impact of our attorneys in court and minimizing drive time. But I went with a client with a student and a client to Skowhegan, one semester. So regionally, if you come up to me and say, I want to go to West Bath, we're going to West Bath. So those conversations can be had.
All right, well, thank you. And I see my cue to wrap us up is here. So I just really hope that those of you listening, it's very strange not to see all of your lovely potential student faces, but I hope this was helpful in your thinking about Maine law and got you interested and excited. And I know everyone on this panel is more than happy to answer questions or have individual conversations if that would be helpful to you. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Carrie.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists, truly for your passion and your commitment to youth justice that you showed us on this panel and that you do every day. So thank you for being with us tonight. I want to say a special thanks to Carrie Weiler and Jeff Cosgrove Cook for the back end work they did on our webinar, which is critical. For the admitted students that are in the webinar, there is a Zoom of all of our clinical programs at 5:30, and that link is in your program or in the email we sent this week. You will see some familiar faces from this webinar. And thank you all for being with us tonight. And, we truly are celebrating the impact of our students at Maine Law. So thank you to our students and our alums. We're grateful. Bye-bye.